Practice and Politics of Contemporary British Theatre. And her doctorate was on Timberlake Wurton Baker. So it's safe to say she knows everything there is to know about Our Country's Good, and we're going to test her today. So I'm going to introduce you to Sophie. She's going to take 10-15 minutes just to explain a bit about her background and about her research and interest and passion in the play. And then we're going to hand back over to me, and I'll ask her some questions and start grilling her. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sophie and I'll mute myself. Here we go, Sophie.
Hi, yeah, I think I slightly misunderstood the 10 to 15 minutes to introduce myself, so I'm not going to talk for 10 to 15 minutes about myself, if that's okay. I think that there's quite a lot of questions, isn't there? And I think it's probably more, I think most of that stuff
Sophie,
will come out of the questions. So
you're a bit quiet.
Okay.
I don't know if it's just for me.
Is there a way to make it louder on?
Oh, it's all right. People can see. People are coming back to me, so I can hear her. So it's just me. So carry on.
Okay. Oh, good. Right. Yeah. So I'm probably not going to talk for 10-15 minutes all in one go, if that's okay. I think probably. Okay. Lots of people are saying it's okay, so that's good.
Yeah. That's fine. Ignore me.
I'll talk for slightly shorter than that. And then we'll get to the questions a bit quicker, if that's okay, because I think I can talk at more length based on the questions. And then if there's things I don't say that people can have a chance, can't they, to put questions in about that as well. So thank you for the introduction, Sarah, and thank you for asking me to do this. My introduction to Our Country's Good and to Timberlake Wurton Baker, full stop, was when I studied her in sixth form. I studied Our Country's Good for A-level theatre studies in the early 2000s. The very early 2000s. And I immediately fell in love with the play. Was extremely inspired by it, and so I always remember that really in terms of like where my career came from actually, and like when I had this latest student edition of Our Country's Good published by Bloomsbury earlier this year, I kind of took it straight back to my A-level theatre studies teacher and gave it back to him and said, you know, this come round because I kind of always owe my whole career to this play and how it was taught to me by sixth form teachers. So I also sometimes I've spoken to sixth form teachers a few times about my experience with the play as if I'm some sort of expert, and I feel I'm slightly like a fraud about that when I think, well, the reason that I love this play is because I was taught so brilliantly by sixth form teachers. So I kind of, although I am an expert on Wurton Baker, I then went and I kind of followed that passion through. I did like an undergraduate dissertation on 4 of Wurton Baker's plays, and then I thought I can't stop learning about Wurton Baker, so I did my PhD on really Wurton Baker's whole oeuvre. You know, I think I can claim to be an expert on kind of her body of work and the different themes and styles across her career. I've engaged with the play with students at various different levels. I've taken it I've done workshops in schools, but I still think I think there are plenty of things that where I would bow to the experience of teachers who have been teaching this play in schools for a long time as well. So I don't want any of this to come across as if I'm teaching anybody how to do or kind of providing huge insights into how you guys will do your jobs brilliantly on a daily basis. So I think all of these things are things that can be debated and discussed. I think when I'm getting back to your questions, a lot of my answers are probably things, they're obviously based on my research, my kind of knowledge of how this play fits into other plays that Wurton Baker's written at similar times before and afterwards, and that kind of informs how I think about this play. It's based on my own experience working practically with the text. It's based on my archival research, looking into the kind of the draft processes. My PhD was using Wurton Baker's archive in detail, so I've been able to see how this play developed across its kind of draft process. I've been able to read, obviously, accounts both kind of from her archive and things that are published about the way that the play was created, with Max Stafford Clark at the Royal Court using the joint stock method, which I'll talk probably more about a bit later when I'm going through specific questions, but using that kind of co-created methodology that still very much leaves the writer as the author of the text, and I think it's always important to stress that, because I think sometimes it's the role of the other people in that process can be exaggerated or used to kind of suggest that it's co-authored, which it isn't, but it's kind of co-researched and developed through having a company of actors and director work on it with the writer. And I think that's one of the things I want to talk about when I'm answering some of the specific questions later on about context and style and form and genre as well. Also, I've kind of researched the background of the play, the kind of the historical and political circumstances of the original production, which we can think about. They're interesting in and of themselves. They're interesting in relation to how we engage with the play today as well. So again, I will talk in more detail about those when I'm responding to the specific questions that have come in about context. I probably should also give a slightly different introduction, in that I'm obviously working from home like everybody else. I have a 2.5-year-old who is hopefully being distracted by her lunch at the moment, but whether that's going to last an hour, I'm not entirely confident. So I do apologise if we are interrupted at any point by a rather insistent 2-year-old. Do you want me to say any more in my kind of general introduction, Sarah, or do you think we can go into the questions now?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. We can start into the questions. We've got lots of questions to get through, haven't we? So as I said, we've had lots of questions coming from you, and we have divided them into sections so that it's slightly easier, and we can all group them into, because we had lots of the same questions come in, which is great, and obviously means that you want to know the answers. So the first set of questions we've got, Sophie, are based on the context surrounding the play. So the first question we had was, do you believe that Timberlake Wertenbaker was reacting to events in the 80s at the time she wrote the play? What was happening at this time that you think influenced her?
Brilliant. Yeah. So this is something that I feel like I can definitely answer. I think that there are probably two related things that are the kind of key things that were going on in the 1980s that fed directly into the creation of this play, and they're both linked to the conservative Thatcherite politics of the time, which generally people in the theatre were not particularly keen on, and I think we can fairly safely say that Wertenbaker and Max Stafford Clark and the company that created the play were trying to challenge. So one of those was to do with the underfunding of the theatre and the arts. So right from the start of actually even before Thatcher's Conservative government came into power in 1979, there'd been a reduction of theatre subsidy, and that kind of kicked in really, really heavily with Thatcher's policies. So organisations were really struggling. The theatre industry in general felt like it was kind of reaching a crisis point. The Royal Court, which was obviously where this Our Country's Good was first produced under the directorship of Max Stafford Clark, but also had been something of a home to Wertenbaker for a number of years. She was their writer in residence in the early 1980s, and before this she'd written a couple of plays, Grace Mary Travers included, for the Royal Court, and so they were reaching a crisis point as well. They had periods around this time where they had to go dark, had to shut the theatres, or at least one of the theatre spaces down for kind of continued periods of time, just because they couldn't afford to put productions on. So there was a real kind of sense of the industry coming together, but to kind of protest about this, and to kind of a real sense of the company wanting to really argue strongly for the value of the theatre, its value on so many different levels, intellectually, socially, artistically. So there's obviously a clear strand in the play which is about making that case. It's made extremely apparent in the scene where the authorities discuss the merits of the theatre, but obviously all the way through, there's a positive endorsement of the theatre. Secondly, as part of those conservative policies, there's also a kind of return to more punitive and less enlightened attitudes towards crime and punishment within the penal justice system. So there's a move away from rehabilitation and education work and towards the sense that prison is about punishment. So we see, as well as the kind of underfunding of theatre in general, there's an underfunding in prison education and the kind of programs that would allow prisoners to put on theatre in prison and stuff like that. And there's kind of a talk in government about the way that criminality is talked about is with this sense of this really kind of old-fashioned sense of criminality being innate. I say old-fashioned, I'm sure that attitude is still horribly prevalent in certain sections of society, and I think that's probably quite evident, particularly evident in the last few weeks as well. But yeah, at this time there was a feeling that we perhaps had some more enlightened attitudes about that in the 60s and the early 70s maybe, and then we're moving out of that into a more kind of judgmental, condemnatory attitude towards the reasons that people might be engaged in criminal activity. So she's pushing back at both those things. She's showing that criminals, convicts are human people who have a lot of complicated factors involved in the things that have led them to commit crime, that their voices deserve to be heard and valued and respected, and at the same time she's showing how theatre can really kind of help with that process, but also in general is a positive thing. She'd done some work with Clean Break Theatre Company before she came to write this play. Clean Break Theatre Company, I assume most of you know, is a company that still operates today, that work with women who have been involved in or are at risk of being involved in the criminal justice system. And that they were formed in 1979, 1980. And Werton Baker was right there at the beginning. She interviewed them, and she kind of did some research and wrote a lesser known play about some women in the criminal justice, sort of a woman who gets out of prison and kind of the prejudice that she's faced with. So she had this history of already engaging with those kind of themes. That then you can see sort of like feeding into Our Country's Good as well.
What are they playing at?
Have you got that email that I've sent you now?
Yes.
Ooh, we can hear some people talking in the background. Following on from that, we've had a question perspective. How can students include reference to the social, cultural and historical knowledge when writing about Our Country's Good from an acting perspective?
Yeah, so I think that what I'm assuming this question is getting at is that in a question where you're asked what would you do as an actor in a certain scene, how do you kind of show that without giving a kind of monologue at the beginning that just lists the contextual factors, which I think is a good question. How do you kind of weave that in? So I suppose one of the ways that I would probably encourage students to do that is to think about how particularly how the convicts are portrayed to be sensitive, nuanced characters who and so if you're writing about how you're performing one of those characters, you can show that you understand that Werton Baker is trying to show that these are human beings who have the same feelings and intelligence and kind of relationships as other people. So in your acting, you're not caricaturing them, or you're mostly not caricaturing them. There are a couple of more kind of two-dimensional characters that I'll talk about a bit later when we're talking about the style. But on the whole, you're trying to show the humanity of those characters in your acting choices, and we can talk about how that stems from Wurton Baker's kind of sympathy with research into the company's research into those characters that they one of the things that Joint Stock did as part of that process was to go out and interview people who had been involved in the criminal justice system and then come back and kind of embody them in rehearsal. And sort of be interviewed as them. So they really tried to take this kind of like real truth, sense of truth back from the kind of people that they were interested in portraying. So I think you can refer to that kind of thing when you're looking at those convict characters in particular. And you can also, I guess, refer to things like the multi-rolling and the fact that you have, obviously that's not necessarily a decision that all subsequent productions have to make, but in the original production you had it so that actors switched between playing convicts and officers in order to kind of highlight the fact that that these were essentially like, the same people, but one lot of people had all these advantages and turned out one way, and one lot of people had all these disadvantages and turned out another. So the sort of the humanity was the same. Although actually in a lot of cases the officer's humanity is quite a lot less. So again, I guess if you were thinking about whether you were switching between roles as well, you might be able to show that understanding of context as part of that discussion. You could also, if in terms of sort of historical context, you could show your understanding of if you've done some research or looked into 18th century acting styles and how they're kind of like portrayed and, to an extent lampooned in the rehearsal scenes. So the kind of, if you look at pictures, you can get the kind of like gestural sort of schema that they had for acting, and look at the kind of different poses, the different emotions that the different poses had, so that when Sideway is kind of talking about demonstrating his melancholy and all this, you can sort of show that you've perhaps done a little bit of research into that side of the history, the kind of acting that was common there, and therefore the kind of because Sideway is obviously kind of like sort of ridiculed by the company for that approach, but actually he's being more accurate in his kind of acting style than the others who have this sort of like naturalistic director-led theatre that didn't exist at the time. So you could discuss that a little bit as well, and how those kind of things and those kind of anachronisms are kind of have played out in the style of that. If anybody is listening who, I know you've been asked to turn your microphones on, but if anyone who's listening is the author of any of these questions, and you think that I've gone off on one and not understood what it is you're actually asking, or not really responded to the thing you were getting at, then please do shout up and clarify anything that I've not understood, and I can provide a fuller response.
Hi, Sophie. I was the author of both of those questions, and I think your answers were super, super helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we have quite a lot of questions come in about the form and the style and the genre. Quite a lot of different questions that we're asking in the same way. But we've kind of combined them into one big question, into how would you describe the form, the style and the genre? So it's quite a big question to answer, but we're going to put them into one.
So yeah, form, style, genre. And I think this is like a question to which I don't think there is like one easy answer. I think that the play doesn't really fall into any one style, and it touches on a number of styles. So the only thing that I would say that sort of it definitely shows the mark of is that it was created with this joint stock method that I mentioned in my introduction. So this was developed by a company called Joint Stock, of which Max Stafford Clark was one of the founding members. And it was one of a number of kind of theatrical collectives that were set up in the 70s to kind of challenge a more director-led hierarchical model of theatre. And there were a number of kind of companies that had like either kind of feminist or socialist or sometimes both aims in the way they were working, and they wanted to kind of look at those themes, but they also wanted to look at like a more democratic way of working in general. So the idea with these productions is that company would work together. In the case of Our Country's Good, it's about 10 actors, Max Stafford Clark, the director, Werton Baker, the writer, and they would have a really extended period of research and development. I mean, research and development is obviously quite a common term now in the way that productions is developed, but it was sort of much less so back then, and also the kind of length of time that they spent was very much a kind of a luxury, really, compared to like the way that theatre would normally be rehearsed in a sort of matter of weeks. So they have this extended period of group research and development where they're doing things like I mentioned earlier, going out and interviewing prisoners, but not just prisoners, sort of people with various kind of expertises. They go into museums which have got, you know, the history of the sort of penal justice system. They're going to like the theatre museum and talking to people who can talk to them about 18th century acting styles. And they're doing lots of drama games, really, which again kind of are very much a part of our kind of classrooms and rehearsal rooms now, but I think maybe were less so at the time. So they were doing lots of the exercises that Max Stafford Clark has become famous for. So exercises to do with status, where you give everyone a playing card and their character has to have the status of that, the number on their playing card, and interact with one another. Exercises that explored kind of ideas around brutality and how people become brutalized if they're treated in certain ways by the people around them. And throughout this time, Werton Baker was kind of like drafting stuff, and they were having a go with it, and characters were starting to emerge. And obviously, of course, also what I've not mentioned is the fact that they had another of the source materials for the play is the Robert Canale's The Playmaker, the novel that the play is kind of fairly loosely based on, and actually a number of other literary sources as well that they were all reading, you know, splitting up the reading of. So the journals of First Fleet officers like Ralph Clark and Captain Phillip, some big historical books about the colonization of Australia and poverty and criminality in London at that time and stuff. So they were all doing that research together, and I think there's a number of ways that that's imprinted on the play, and a number of those ways cross over with some of the hallmarks of what we might think of as epic theatre. So things like a kind of an ensemble cast where there are a number of different protagonists rather than one identifiable protagonist, a number of shorter scenes, although there are some quite long scenes as well, but a lot of quite short scenes, and you know, some fairly kind of strong social messages. I would stop short of calling the play an epic play. It's certainly not epic in the true Brechtian sense, and I think it's useful for students to, particularly if they've studied Brecht, to identify the Brechtian influences, the influences of the epic in the text. But I definitely wouldn't encourage them to to describe it as Brechtian or as epic myself. So I think I would use the word episodic before I use the word epic, probably when talking about the play. And then, like I say, there are kind of some sort of, not conflicting, because I think it works, but there are some quite different sort of influences as a result of that. So there are certainly aspects of the acting and performance which seem to lend themselves most to naturalistic or realistic acting. So characters like Liz and Duckling and Mary, they've all been developed, like I say, by this very kind of by a process of the actor really identifying with the character, being hot seated. They use that technique a lot in development, and kind of so really thinking about all the kind of underlying backstories, histories of the characters, helping to develop all that kind of like psychological realism of the character. There are also characters like Shitty Meg and to an extent like Reverend Johnson, who are much more representational roles, and interestingly a lot of those are the roles that were originally cross-cast in terms of gender in the original production. So there are roles that do require a much less identified, much more kind of gestical, kind of surface level portrayal, and they sit alongside each other in the same play, and that seems to work. And likewise, the design lends itself in general to a more minimal or representational design, just by the practicality of the number of scenes and the brevity of some of those scenes. But that again doesn't mean, and we've got quite a few questions about design coming up, so that doesn't mean that there aren't other things you can do with the design as well. So yeah, I kind of that's not a kind of a kind of clear categorization to me of this play. I don't think Werton Baker is consciously writing within any particular form, style, or genre. She's writing a play that interests her, that draws on a number of different influences that she's had as a well-educated person who had read a lot and seen a lot of theatre and literature. And I think there's more. I think that in subsequently there's now more of a tendency for us to want to and to ask our students, and for exam boards to like students to kind of to be identifying what kind of form or style or genre it is. But certainly, so I don't want to kind of, if people know, because I'm not an expert on exam boards, if people know that their exam boards require students to categorize it in a certain way, then certainly don't let me tell you not to try and do that with students. But I would always, certainly coming from like a university perspective, I would want students to understand the nuance there, and that you can't put something in a neat shelf of what it is, really.
Yeah, great. We're going to move on to, as you mentioned, the staging and design questions, because we've had quite a few in. But to start with, are there any recent or famous productions of the play that are good to reference or look out when they're looking at with their students?
Yeah, so this is kind of restricted, obviously, by what's available, and particularly now, like what's available on the internet easily. So there's very little in terms of video material that I've been able to find. I think that there are a number of like amateur or college productions that have put videos on the internet, but generally I discourage students from looking at those because I'd rather that they thought about how to do it themselves than looked at how some other schools or colleges were doing it. In terms of photos, there's a little bit more going. So the two most recent productions that I think are most interesting to think about are the Ramps on the Moon production, which is, so I don't know, a lot of you probably may have seen this. So Ramps on the Moon are a theatre company who work with a company that is very diverse in terms of disability. and ability. And so they did what I thought was a really interesting, quite beautiful production that really kind of like flagged up some of the stuff about whose voices are heard, how they're heard, how we make them heard, etc. And so there's a number of photographs, their production online, and there's also a number of videos that aren't really, that, you know, it's not like obviously a video of the whole show, but there are trailers and that show very short sections of the rehearsal performance, and there were some interviews with the people involved in the production process as well. So that they're quite interesting to look at. The National Theatre production, which was a few years before that, also has quite a lot of production photographs online, and that, you know, that was quite an interesting production too, because it was on a very big stage on the Olivier Auditorium in the National Theatre. So, and obviously with like a huge budget. So if you're looking for stuff, you know, to compare the kind of production that you might do in your school drama studio compared to what you might do if you had a huge budget, that's quite interesting from that point of view as well. And then you can find a number of other you can find production photos of like a number of other like college, like some quite sort of obviously well-resourced college productions, I think from America, some of which do have really interesting designs actually. I think that's sort of people operating at kind of like a drama school level, so they've got the kind of budgets to support it. And then obviously you can find productions of people who are doing it in a drama studio that look kind of like your drama studio. So again, they might be interesting for students to have a look at as well, because you know, but looking at the kind of range of resources that people are using. So I won't. I've got to make sure I don't go on too much, otherwise we'll not get these questions.
Fine. So we've had two questions in that I'm going to ask together, so then you can just answer them both. So students need to develop their own production concepts for set plays, especially when preparing for A-level. What scope is there for a wide range of concepts, and do you have advice for guiding that process? Was one. And the second was integrating historical, social and cultural context to underpin practical ideas. How could this play be staged in different ways? I guess they're quite similar there.
Yeah, so I took these questions to kind of, to be about the sort of overall sort of staging concept you might go for, or rehearsal kind of strategies that you might go for. So I think it's important to stress that there is lots of scope for doing this play in sort of subtly different ways. So when I interviewed Werton Baker for the guide, for the student edition of the play, she was kind of really keen to stress that she felt that there'd been a bit of a kind of emphasis on the only way to do this is using a kind of, you know, thinking about Max Stafford Clark as a practitioner and applying actioning as a kind of as a technique that Max Stafford Clark kind of introduced to the theatre, or certainly kind of made more prevalent in British theatre during his career, and that production should kind of look like his production and stay that way. And she was really keen to say, no, that's not like, that's how we did it to begin with, because that was the way that sort of made the most sense at the time. But that doesn't mean to say that you cannot really do anything you want with it. And she referenced a couple of examples of kind of really interesting and innovative productions she'd seen. She really liked the Ramps on the Moon one that I was talking about, and the National Theatre one, but also she saw a really interesting production in Romania where they really had kind of done some quite different things with it that made it kind of very relevant to them. This was some time ago, and it was kind of like post-revolutionary Romania, and she felt like that the production really responded to kind of the political moment there. And although it was kind of in some ways quite unrecognizable to her as the play, how she'd previously seen the play, that was kind of really interesting and really moving. That said, I would be a bit wary of the idea of kind of concept productions of the play. So I do think this is a history play of sorts. I think it would be difficult to give it a setting that wasn't 18th century Australia, unless, I don't know, you were doing something really kind of meta with it and making it a play within a play within a play, where you're saying like, well, we're going to set it in a prison, and then they're going to do a production of Our Country's Good that's going to have a production of The Recruiting Officer within it, or something like that. That's the only way that I could kind of really see it having a very obvious setting that wasn't its historical setting, because it is about that very specific historical moment. And I don't think that translates in the way that you might say, I'm going to put Romeo and Juliet on the streets of New York. I don't think it kind of is transferable in that way. For me, the way that each production should find its own identity is through its company. So the reason that Romanian production was interesting was not because somebody said, let's set it in post-revolutionary Romania. It's because they were producing it in post-revolutionary Romania, and so it naturally had the kind of stamp and the atmosphere of what was going on at the time. Likewise, if you're, the prison productions of this play have had a big, Werton Baker's seen the play in prisons and being very moved by it. That's clearly going to be a very different production. But again, I think that's more interesting than a company of actors saying, let's set it in a prison. So for me, it's about each group of students or group of actors who's working on this play to think like, well, what do we connect with about personally do we connect with in this play at this moment in time? And I wrote a bit in the blog that hopefully some of you have had a look at, that kind of preceded this session, about how that there are clearly things that particularly resonate with our current moment about this play, things to do with kind of feeling trapped or incarcerated and kind of yearning for things that you don't have, as well as quite a lot of more abstract kind of political things about how we value different lives in different ways, and how we deal with kind of things to do with patriotism, things to do with jingoistic attitudes and stuff. So I think that's what I would kind of encourage students to do if they're looking for kind of like, a stamp or a concept to put on the production, is to think about how they connect with it personally. I don't know if that's a full answer to those questions, but that was kind of my feelings about those questions.
And from a design perspective, how would you use the set to reflect the context?
So I should probably, I think this is probably obvious, but I'm not a scenographer, and I'm not an expert in theatre design. So this is kind of coming from my understanding of the play rather than any sort of real design expertise. So the things I guess that I would be most looking at the set to do would be to communicate something about what it was like for those people to be in Australia at that time. So the way that you might use colours and textures and space to convey some of that heat, some of that noise, some of that discomfort and kind of alien sense of like, we've been under these decks of these ships with barely any natural light for like months, and then we've suddenly been out onto this shore where there's like brilliant sun and ridiculous heat and animals we've never seen before. And so that kind of overwhelming sense of alienation from the environment would be something that I would want to see perhaps reflected in the set in some way. How you would do that, I'm not an expert in, but for me that would probably be something to do with the kind of colour palettes and the use of space and textures.
And following on from that, how would you explore it with students via remote learning during this time?
So I've kind of suggested, there's a couple of exercises that I've suggested in the blog. One of them is about what we've talked about already, looking at photographs of other productions, and then probably using those as like a stimulus for having your own discussions about the play and what it is, what the play needs, kind of practically, what it needs. So in terms of, we need to change the set at these points. We need these many things for people to sit on at this point. Someone needs to be raised above the level of other people at that point. So those kind of things. And then also kind of more atmospherically and symbolically, like the kind of stuff I was talking about to do with kind of being in Australia for the first time. So I'd kind of probably use some of those images as a stimulus into some of those discussions. Obviously require knowledge of the text as well. And then I would probably think about things like sort of sketchbooks or model boxes. I know there was a question as well about sort of how to help students into that, how to help them. Obviously you're not art and design teachers on the whole, and neither am I, and so how to kind of facilitate students in some of those processes that are perhaps like slightly less clearly what they signed up for when they took A-level theatre studies than acting. So I think I would always kind of encourage to make it really clear that that's not about artistry, and it's not about them being able to draw a realistic person wearing a costume or to draw what the set would like really look like, but that it's about being representational, and to kind of think about how, actually in some ways I think that although doing a model box might seem more complicated and fussy than doing drawings, it might actually reassure students who don't think they can draw that they can do something, because they can, sprinkle sand over the bottom of something and kind of stick some matchsticks in it to be trees or something. So I think I'd be clear to students that we're not looking for stuff that's artistic, that we're looking for kind of overall impressions about colour and texture and material, rather than kind of an accurate sense of exactly what things would look like.
Great. So we're going to move on to some questions we've had about dialogue and debate and a few of the scenes within the play itself. Two of the questions that come in I'm going to ask you together. So Our Country's Good is an incredible and valuable play that students have embraced from the start. However, in some of the longer dialogue content, example Captain Phillips, for example, the dialogue is often harder to explore and stage practically because of the length of some scenes between the two characters. How have you had students engage with this most successfully in the past, is the first part. And then the second part is students often fear Act 1 and Scene 6, where all the officers are debating. So how might you engage them with this moment and help them understand the stance that each character undertakes and the undertones in this scene?
So I think this relates slightly to what I was talking about earlier, to do with the way that you could think about the play and approach it in a number of different styles. So one way that I think you can help students get into these quite debatey, dialogue-y, talky scenes is through a kind of Stanislavskian / Max Stafford Clarkian approach of breaking them up into units, applying objectives. So, especially something like The Authorities Discuss the Merits of the Theatre, like thinking really clearly about what the objectives are of each of those characters, what strategies they're using to achieve those objectives at different parts of the play. How can you kind of section that up to look at who's winning the argument at different points, and where that changes, where somebody else starts to really work on their objective instead. And then the slightly lesser known but also kind of related technique of actioning, which is what was really developed by Max Stafford Clark out of a Stanislavskian approach. So actioning is where you apply a transitive verb, so something you can do to someone, on to each line of the play. So I entreat you, I implore you, I scold you, you know, those kind of, that's why it's called actioning, because it's like something you can do to someone else. And so that is a process that I think students particularly, I mean, students even at degree level find quite wearing and difficult to do to a whole play, which is what Max Stafford Clark would have his company sit around and do on the first however many days of rehearsal. And so I think would definitely be pretty challenging to apply to long sections of text for sixth form students. But I think that you could look at particular smaller chunks of text in that way and see whether people felt that choosing those very specific actions helped breathe life and kind of definition into each moment of the play, which is what Max Stafford Clark believed it did. Also, I think you could look at those scenes in a more kind of dialectical Brechtian way, because they are about these often very opposing viewpoints having a debate. Personally, I think students are more likely to engage with the Stanislavskian way, but I think it would be interesting perhaps to try a little bit of both, either have like one side of your class doing it one way, the other side of your class doing it the other way, and then seeing the difference that happens in those scenes with those different approaches, or kind of, you know, getting the same group of students to try it both ways so that they can feel, you know, in a more embodied way what it's like to do it in a more majestic representational way or a more psychologically identified Stanislavskian way. So I think though that's what I might offer in response to those slightly more in sort of intellectually heavy, chalky scenes.
I had a small character question come in via the chat box actually about what is your interpretation of Captain Campbell?
Right. Is that it in its entirety?
Yeah.
Okay.
we've had it's coming from Sharon actually. So Sharon, if you're on the call, you can unmute yourself and ask Sophie your question if you'd like. Might not be able to unmute herself.
Hello. Can you hear
there you
me?
go. Yeah, we can hear you. Yep.
My students have just discussed extensively, you know, why he can't speak in full sentences, why he goes behind Major Ross. We've talked about whether he'd been injured in the American War of Independence. We've seen productions where he's been portrayed perhaps simplistically as drunk. We've had quite a lot of conversation. I just wondered what you thought about him.
So I think it's, for me, it's less about kind of him as a, I suppose I've thought less about him in that level of detail as a kind of, what are the psychological reasons behind him being like that? Because I think I would probably put him slightly towards the more, the on the spectrum of characters that are psychologically developed to characters that are caricatures. I think he's, to me, not fully towards the caricatured end of it, but somewhere more down that end of it. And so for me, it's more about what he represents within the ensemble, which I think is the way that Wertenbaker writes for such a range of different voices and articulacies. So there are so many different, there are different languages, there are different, many different dialects, and then many different levels of articulacy. And she's obviously deliberately made it so that it's not a sense that we've got officers who speak very articulately and convicts who don't. We've got we've got both on both sides of things. So as well as convicts like as well as officers like Collins or Philip, who can like lengthily intellectually debate stuff, you've also got ones like Ross, who's just so angry all the time that he's invented his own language of expletives, or Campbell, who's barely articulate. And then on the convict side of things, you've got convicts like Mary, who's barely audible to begin with, like Liz, who kind of uses silence to protect herself, but also We've got, Wisehammer, who's always loved words. We've got Sideways, who expresses himself very theatrically. We've got Liz, who, although she does use silence, also can have this incredible monologue in her own dialect. So that's more how I've interpreted that character, as part of a kind of deliberate spectrum of articulacy. And I think that's really interesting that your students have been kind of interested enough in that character to kind of think maybe about some of the more psychological reasons behind the way, or kind of historical contextual reasons that might explain his being like that. But it's not something that I've thought about in that detail.
Great. And we had a question about the play for today, really, so the time today. So we're living in a time where theatre is under threat. How can we ensure that Words and Bacon's messages in the play about the vitality and necessity of theatre be heard?
Yeah, so I think we're absolutely right. There's a great number of threats, both ones that are kind of very, very recent and longer, more long-standing threats to the theatre and to the arts industry. And I think that's obviously in particularly sharp relief in the last few months. So I suppose one thing to say is that although the play was very much received as a rallying cry to the theatre industry, and it was beloved by other people who worked in the theatre industry, and has continued to be so, I think it's arguably an even stronger advocate for people making their own theatre in schools, in prisons, in their own communities. And so, I mean, obviously, I'm aware that is equally at risk at the moment. It's not obviously just professional theatre that's at risk. It's very, very difficult for us to be making theatre in our classrooms or in our youth clubs or really anywhere. But that is still happening. So I know someone who's recently directed a Zoom production with the National Youth Theatre, and so there are ways that people, I mean, obviously, as you know, you're still engaging with your classes, and there are people engaging with kind of communities and youth theatres all across the country. So I think us kind of emphasising the importance of that, protecting that, speaking out for that as much as possible is going to be really important. I think clearly there are quite difficult conversations connected to this around who has access to that and therefore voice through that. I mean, youth theatre and the people taking part in those kind of activities have perhaps often been skewed towards more privileged children and young people. But there have also been a number of initiatives where they're very specifically reaching out to more disadvantaged people. I think that's harder at the moment due to kind of what we know would now know to call technological poverty. So obviously people's access to computers and the internet in order to engage with the kind of online continuation of some of those activities. Clearly there are people who have got very limited or no recourse to those things, and who stand to be further and further marginalized by and made more and more voiceless by the current circumstances. So I think we need to have conversations about that, don't we? And how I don't know what the answer is to those things. I think it's really, really difficult. I think there is also a sense that we can use this current moment to kind of take a breath and think about how we go back into, I'm sure everyone's seen a lot of things talking about going back to normal and what that really means, and how we reformulate our normal in a way that is more just and more allows more voices to be heard, so we don't just reconstruct exactly the same problematic systems that we've had a break from. And obviously some of those systems we do need to reconstruct because they were really working, but other ones really weren't, and we need to think about that as we go back into it. So I suppose we can all play a part in that as we and our organisations debate the way that they're going to start operating again. And obviously, most of us have a very limited amount of power within those conversations and those decisions, but we can use what we have in the way that we can, and actually kind of I think sometimes I surprise myself by making a suggestion at a meeting where I think I'm not very important here. Is this going to be? Is anyone going to go with this? And actually, a couple of times in the last week, people have gone with my my suggestion that we need to think more carefully about, you know, different aspects of our curriculum and whose voices it's addressing and representing. So that's really that sort of is encouraging, and we can be involved in those conversations. I think I'm slightly going at a tangent to this question, but I think I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the most important thing about this play is the fact that students, in my experience, do seem to really connect with it emotionally and kind of politically as well. Like they can get passionate about the way that the injustice, it really shows injustice, doesn't it? I think that's it. It kind of like really vividly depicts injustice, and we are seeing vivid depictions of injustice perhaps more than ever before at the moment through social media and the news and everything. So I think we can use some of the way that the play kind of really highlights those things to people through its kind of humanization and kind of focus down on particular instances of that to kind of open up conversations about those broader injustices in society and how we can try to work against them, really.
Yeah, absolutely. We have come to the 1 o'clock cut off, I'm afraid, but thank you so much, Sophie, for answering all those questions, and thank you for everybody to coming on the call and asking all those questions in advance. It's all been such a great help. We hope you found the webinar useful. We know you've had a few questions come in via the chatbot about the blog that Sophie was referring to earlier. If you go onto the Bloomsbury website and type in Our Country's Good, the student edition, on the right hand side you'll find the link to the blog that she's referring to. It's got lots of different ideas about what you can do with your students in remote learning at this time. And also we have recorded this session, so we will send out the recording either tomorrow or just at the end of this week, so you can all access it again and share it with your colleagues and students if you need to. Are you poised to say something, Sophie?
I was just going to say, if there were questions that I didn't get to because I didn't realise quite how much was going on in the chat whilst I was like whittering on about stuff. So if like I didn't get to anyone's question or I didn't answer anyone's question fully enough, then I'm happy for my email to go out to people who were here if that's useful, if anyone kind of wants to follow up on anything.
That's great, thank you. I can send that out in the follow-up email to everybody with the recording. Thank you. So I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day and their lunch probably now, and congratulations to your husband and your daughter for staying away so big as well.
Like, the first meeting ever. I think that they have been under more strict instructions than they usually are. Usually it's not worth trying, but this I was like,
you've done it. It just goes to show, doesn't it? Anyway, so thank you so much for talking to us, and have a good rest of the week, everybody. Bye.